Hey there, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast. I'm Dr. Heidi K. Begay, and I'm a flutist, educator, coach, and podcaster. My God-given mission is to serve you. I am passionate about guiding you, the modern-day flutist, to discover your unique voice on and off the stage. The goal of this podcast is to help you thrive, both as an artist and as a musicpreneur. Go ahead and grab some espresso, your favorite notepad, and let's get to it. Today's episode 236 is titled Discovering the Unique Voice of Each Instrument with the Wm.S. Haynes Flute Makers. Founded in Dallas, Texas in 1996, the Carolyn Nesbaum Music Company is renowned for its international service for flutists of all levels. The Carolyn Nesbaum Music Company is your premier resource for everything flute. Their selection of flutes, piccolos, low flutes, and head joints from dozens of makers is truly remarkable. Also, their offerings of sheet music, instrumental accessories, teaching, and health resources are unmatched. Their in-house staff offers an unparalleled level of expert knowledge and personal service with an in-house repair staff certified in all major brands. Follow the Carolyn Nesbaum Music Company through Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter to be updated with the latest news. Check out their website at flute4u.com. The Carolyn Nesbaum Music Company is truly your one-stop flute shop. Hey there, flute friend. Thank you so much for tuning into another Flute 360 podcast episode. Today's content brings me so much joy to deliver through your earbuds because this is the first time in over 200 plus episodes where I get to speak with flute makers. I have spoken in the past with flute repair people, but never flute makers. So soak up this information. Some gems that really tickled my fancy include pulling out each voice of each individual flute during the flute making process. Thank you so much to Carolyn and to the Haynes Company for continuing your precious support of the podcast. Enjoy this conversation and feel free to let your flute friends know about Flute 360 so that way they can subscribe to the weekly content through their favorite podcast app. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, to the Flute 360 podcast. I am so pumped that I am sitting here with the wonderful Wm.S. Haynes Flute Makers. I have in the room with me David, Aiven, and Joy. Welcome, you three, to the show, and I cannot wait to get to know you that much better. But thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah. How is today Wednesday? How are your Wednesdays?
So far, so good.
Yeah.
Yep.
I had to think what day of the week it is. It's been a very interesting 2023. David and I said pre-recording, how are we mid-February already? It's insane.
Yeah, it's flying.
Yeah. Well, to keep it flying, I'm going to start flying some questions your way so that way I can pick your brain. And then this way the listeners can learn a lot about your team and your company. And so I want to preface a little bit. You guys are the first flute makers to ever make an appearance on Flute 360, which is a really big deal because we are 230 episodes in. We're going into year 5, and the only conversations that I've had remotely around this topic are with repair people. So I'm sure there's a lot of parallels between the two worlds, but you guys are it. You are the first flute makers on Flute 360.
Well, that's awesome. We're excited.
Yeah. So I have all the questions because you're the first. So I think it's appropriate for perhaps David to start. Feel free to, we're just going to go round robin. Feel free to introduce yourselves, share anything about your musical background that you would like to share with the listeners, and then we can dive into some questions.
Okay. Okay, so I guess I'll start then. Well, my name is David Shapani, and I've been making flutes for about 37 years. I went to the Massachusetts College of Art and Design for metals work and jewelry design and sculpture. And so that's where first found out about the first time I worked for a flute company was I was still at school. So I started while I was still at school, and that's been my only full-time job since I left school. I just was been making flutes for all that time. I play saxophone, and my father played saxophone, so I have somewhat of a musical background, but I'm more focused, or I've had more training than like formal training in the visual arts and with working with metals and jewelry, that kind of thing. And of course, the 37 years of being a flute maker has taught me just about everything you need to know about how to make a flute out of the precious metals that we do use, like silver and gold, and all the different techniques that go into making that. And I've been at the Wm.S. Haynes Company for the majority of my career as a flute maker.
Wow, how fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I'm going to come back to this. I'm putting a pin in this idea just mainly for my own knowledge. But the jewelry and the sculpting aspect, how fascinating. I'm sure there are a lot of parallels between flute making and those two worlds.
Yes, there are. Wm.S. Haynes, they were jewelers to begin with, and Vern Q. Powell was an engraver. He started at the Wm.S. Haynes Company. And even the Wm.S. Haynes Company, when they were in Boston for all those years, the first 100 years of their existence, they had a very strong connection with the jewelry trade in Boston. And a lot of our supplies, and there was a lot of back and forth between the jewelers' buildings. We have buildings in Boston that have all the jewelry shops and suppliers and craftspeople working in these 3 or 4 different buildings in downtown. And so the Wm.S. Haynes Company was located in Boston proper for many years. And so there was back and forth, getting supplies or taking things to the engravers or buying tools and stuff between the two, industries, the flute making and the jewelry. And actually, the word stringer, the people who make the keys on a flute are traditionally called stringers.
Huh.
And and so that's because the keys are kind of strung along the steel axles. The mechanism actually works like a hinge. So there's a pin or an axle inside the key mechanism, and the keys are strung along that axle on the flute. And that's kind of similar to the way they string pearls on a pearl necklace. So people who make pearl necklaces and string pearls on cords, they're called stringers. But so aren't flute makers that make the keys, because it's kind of the same situation where you're stringing something along an inner core.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to totally geek out. I had no idea. That is so fascinating. And
Yeah.
Aiven and Joy are literally, I can see them out of the corner of my eyes, like getting giddy for me because they can see my reaction. I had no idea. And thank
Yeah.
you for that history about the jewelry making. I really did not know. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's maybe why William S. Haynes decided to work in precious metals, really, because when the company first started in 1888, it was more about wooden flutes. Flutes were
Okay.
made out of wood, and we made a lot. The company itself made a lot of. There were a lot of milestones. Like we made the first all platinum flute,
Hmm.
and I believe if not the first in America, we made the first silver flute.
Hmm.
So there is that connection between the precious metals and the William S. Haynes Company and the jewelry industry in Boston. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Let's put a pin in that because I'm sure like the lineage and the history is something we are definitely going to dive into. And you can see right there already how much passion David has for what he does. I mean, you know such a wealth of information and it's just blowing my mind. It is, oh my goodness. You can really tell I'm like dorking out over here. Okay, so before we go down that rabbit hole, Aiven and Joy, feel free to share your musical backgrounds and all that jazz. So Joy, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So I started off as a flute player. That's where my formal education is. I went to school for flute performance. I finished my undergraduate degree at SUNY Fredonia in New York State. And while I was deciding what I was going to do next, was I going to take some time? Was I going to try to go on to grad school auditions? Was I going to try to work a little bit? I decided that I really, really hated being a waitress. So to try to broaden my horizons a little bit and move on in my career in some way, I started looking to see, could I work in the flute industry in any way? I'd never thought for a second that I would be qualified as a flute maker. I'd had some basic repair for band directors in college and things like that. I had a definite interest in it and done a little bit of basic top-down repair work, but I was like, wow, there's no way that I'd ever be hired as a flute maker, but wouldn't it be cool to work for a flute company? So I applied for a sales job and a flute maker job, figuring, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And it turns out they just train for that. So if people wonder, how do you become a flute maker? You just apply, just ask.
Okay.
Yeah,
Fair.
for any of the flute making positions, it turns out they don't necessarily want someone who is coming in with an established concept of like, this is how I make a flute. I worked for X other flute companies and I'm just going to come in and I'm going to make the flutes the way I know how to do it. Each individual company wants to be able to show people their individual ways that make their flutes characteristically them. So in a lot of cases for making custom flutes, for working on any of the production instruments that we make here, we'd much rather start with someone who's very eager and very passionate about the flute and working in the industry, and we'll train them. So that's what I did. I started off first as a flute patter. So I was responsible for the last step of assembling the flute. So putting in the pads, springs, felts, and things like that. Everything that makes it play at the end was where I started. From there, I also learned how to do repairs, and I learned how to test and do the final adjustments to set up flutes before they go out the door. And then for the last, I don't know, I think I've been at Haynes for probably 11, maybe 12 years at this point. I think this will be my 18th year in the flute industry, which is crazy. And for the bulk of my time here at Haynes, what I've been doing is that last final finishing step, setting up the instrument, helping train the people who are doing the padding and repairs and things like that to make sure that every Haynes flute that we send out the door has its own unique personality and its best voice shines while still being a good representation of Haynes.
Oh my goodness, Joy, that was phenomenal. Thank you for taking us down your musical journey. And you've already answered some questions that I had in the lineup of questions for later. So you're already like 10 steps ahead of me. So thank you. But we will circle back to those different topics. Aiven, please share with the listeners a little bit about your musical journey.
Sure. So a lot like Joy, I started out as a flute player. I got my undergraduate degree at Ithaca College and my master's in flute, both in flute performance, my master's at Indiana University. One key difference in my journey here is that I grew up in the Boston area. And so like flute making was something I knew that was here, right? So when I came back from school, I just threw out all my lines. I had no idea what I really wanted to end up doing. So I was teaching and I was playing and I started working at a flute company. And I have to say, like, it took me a while to find my niche within flute making itself.
Okay.
I started off, I don't think David knows this. I started off as a key assembler. And then I went from there to finishing, and I was pretty miserable. I didn't like it at all. The amount of detail work and close-up work was not for me specifically. But the cool thing about flute making is that there's so many different types, there's so many different steps and different ways to come about it. So the head joint maker at the time heard me play, and I was after work and I was playing, and he was like, "Hey, I want you to try this." So I tried head joint making, and I was hooked like from the instant a scraper was in my hand. I started, scraping. The satisfying feel of scraping metal while you're scraping a head joint is amazing. And on top of it all, I could hear the differences in the metals and the different types of head joints and things like that. So it was sort of a little bit more of an instant gratification for me in some ways, but in the long run, takes a really long time to train to do that. So that was a process. But I always joke about how I fell into this, and it's literally what happened. Like I said, I threw out all these lines and I kept becoming more and more focused on head joints over the course of the past 21 years.
Wow. Congratulations to all three of you. And Aiven, that is such a wonderful story. And there's a lot of lessons there and gold nuggets that we can take from each one of your individual stories for the listeners. Because a lot of 360, if you don't know, is, looking at the flutist from all these different sides, the human, the artist, and the career go-getter. And one of the messages that I preach a lot through the platform is you don't have to go down one of these two traditional paths. You do not have to be an orchestral player if that's not in your heart. You do not have to be in academia if that's not in your heart. But if it is, go for it. More power to you. And what I'm trying to showcase through this digital platform is that you have options. And what I heard from all three of your stories is that, yes, you're flute makers, but you basically showed me that there's a niche within and underneath that umbrella of flute making. And I hadn't wrapped my head around that. Like, yes, I understood that there's a head joint maker and there's like a flute maker, but I didn't realize and you'll have to walk me through top to bottom and all the different roles. But what you said, Aiven, was point on yeah, I was a flute maker, but I had to find my passion and my niche under that umbrella. How genius is that? And what I hear is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Aiven, but what I'm hearing is it took you a while or took you some time and some seasons to hone in on what that was for you. And so, what is your piece of advice then for the listeners out there? They're like, okay, I'm an educator. Yes, okay, I know I'm going to go into flute making or flute repair. As you were trying to figure out your niche under flute making, what was the pivotal moment when you decided, ooh, and maybe you already highlighted it the minute you got that sculpting tool in your hand and you heard the metal scraping or whatever it was. But what piece of advice would you give to that listener if they are trying to find their niche within their umbrella?
Yeah, it was hard at first. I had to keep an open mind. I think that was the biggest thing. I wasn't necessarily finding what was working for me right off the bat, right? Like I was trying all these different things, but one thing I always did was I continued to say yes to these opportunities, and I continued to try. I was lucky. People thought, "Oh, she's a flute player. Let's try with all these different things." And I'm sure in other disciplines and teaching or anything, these opportunities present themselves, and I just tried. And if something looked even the least bit interesting to me, I would try it. And then what happened after that is I did find head joints, right? And I think this can go for anyone. You find something that's really working for you. I think also in turn, not being afraid to let go of some of those other things that aren't working for you. I think it's just keeping an open mind.
Ooh, I love that. And you get to kind of dabble and you notice the breadcrumbs. You're like, ooh, this looks yummy. Let me try this. And then you realize, nutmeg and cinnamon, that's not for me. I'm more of, blank
Right.
type of girl or guy. So I love that story and I love that message that you're sending. So thank you so much for that. So let's circle back to flute making in general. You guys have hinted at the key. I'm going to totally embarrass myself. The key person, or, can you walk me through the different roles, the different hats, the timeline? What does the process look like from top to bottom of putting together, let's say, a handmade Haynes flute?
Well, I can start. Well, the process starts with my expertise in my departments anyway. So
Okay.
we can start with me, and this is how the tours are given too. They start in the machine shop where everything begins. Yeah. So the handmade flute is you have sterling or coin silver and 14 karat gold and platinum tubes and casting grain, and we have the raw materials, just the metals that come in. So we take a tube, and you start with it starts it starts out more of like a machining and kind of a standard kind of parts making type of operation where we could be making there's really maybe not even any that no difference or not a big difference between if we were making small pieces of jewelry versus parts for a flute. As the process goes on further, it becomes more important to think about how the thing's going to sound and how it's going to come together and how it's going to feel. If there's two most important aspects or elements of making flutes, it's how it's going to sound naturally and how it's going to feel. And the way you put it together physically, what types of metals, how you put the metals together, how you fit the keys together, that all it contributes to the eventual feel and sound of the instrument. So although we do start out machining parts with castings and machine parts, and we use silver solder and brazing, and we put things together in the same way a jeweler would put a piece of jewelry together, the goal is so different from making jewelry that you have to really understand that you're making flutes, and we train our people that way. That you're making something that's going to have to function mechanically, but then also be this kind of connection to an artistic realm that's going to develop as the flute is finished through the shop and actually how it's used by the artist. And you can never forget that. If you make a flute as if you're just making pieces of jewelry, it won't be a good flute. You always have to keep the end purpose in mind, which is an artistic implement to kind of be involved in the artistic process of making music. So we take tubes and castings and we solder the pieces together. There's a whole world of specifications and criteria that they have to meet, measurements. We use calipers that go down to half a thousandth of an inch when we're measuring the pieces. As Aiven said, sitting at a bench is a very intensive type of work. You have to have a great concentration skills and be able to assemble these instruments and actually craft them by hand. There is room for the visual arts, and like I'm a sculptor major, and I'm a visual artist myself. That's really what my talent is, and where I gravitated toward just naturally. So my connection to flute making was a little more straightforward, where I was making sculptures and jewelry and designing things, and then I do exactly that with musical instruments. So it's kind of more of a direct application from what I went to school for, what my natural disposition is. So yeah, as you're making the flute, you do use all these criteria and measurements and technical aspects of it. We have computer drawings, SolidWorks drawings. Things are engineered. There are engineering parts of it. That's what's so interesting about flute making, is that it's an endeavor that it kind of combines in a really unique way this machinist, engineer, and artist, even in making the instruments, because you have to have some type of aesthetic awareness is when you're putting these things together. Things have to be straight, the keys have to look beautiful, and a lot of those nice, beautiful curves and like the shapes of the Y arms, those are put in by the flute maker by hand, like on a Haynes flute. And so you get a little bit of the input, like the visual input, the 3D, art side of it when the flute maker crafts and shapes a Y arm or shapes a pointed arm and puts the flute together. It looks like a Haynes and it feels like a Haynes, but there is an artistic concern, a three-dimensional concern of when the flute maker makes the instrument, so that to make it look beautiful. And they actually do have a lot of control and input in that respect, the flute makers. So you have to measure parts and make sure they're exactly right and measure them within a thousandth of an inch. But that same part has to be shaped and crafted beautifully so it looks beautiful and feels beautiful when you play the instrument.
Thank you for elaborating on that entire process.
Hey everyone, Corinne Smith from the Wm.S. Haynes Flute Company here. Founded in Boston, Massachusetts in 1888, the Wm.S. Haynes Company has been striving to make the finest flutes for 135 years and is the oldest continually manufacturing flute company in the world. The legendary Haynes sound is that of depth, sweetness, and projection. This unparalleled tone, combined with a precise mechanism and scale, brings a personal and distinctive feeling to the player, a profound connection that is unmistakably Haynes. The company's dedication to the Boston tradition of flute making and meeting the demands of a modern flutist is carried through every instrument which bears the iconic Haynes monogram. From the gifted middle schooler to the talented high school student, from the aspiring professional player to the skillful and enthusiastic amateur, and from the teaching studio to the international stage, the lineup of Amadeus, Q-Series, and custom handmade flutes offers a Haynes for every player. To learn more about us and our products and services, please visit our website at www.wmshaines.com.
And Joy, you mentioned this earlier too, and maybe you can fill us in with something that David had said, and the wheels in my head are turning. He says something along the lines of, if you approach, the instrument making from the standpoint of just engineering an instrument from the scientific side of things, right, then you're missing the artistry. What characteristic then are you guys, and there's probably more than one, but what are you infusing then to make it sound beautiful, where then that artistry can be amplified? How do you approach a mechanical instrument then for it to not be mechanical, but for the artistry to shine? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a twofold approach to that. So when we're looking at the end of the process, after the flute has gone through each step before that, there are like 5 key processes that happen in the flute. There's the beginning of the process where the parts are made. There's the body maker who assembles the tube and the tone holes and the ribs. There's the stringer that Dave talked about that solders all the keys together and puts them on. There's the padder who installs the pads. And my standing joke on the tours is they take it from a flute-shaped object to a finished flute that plays. There's the tester at the end, which is the part that I do the most of, and then there's the head joint maker beyond that. So each step of the process has its own precise checklist of measurements that they have to hit. And the body maker might precisely make something to 0.003 of an inch, where a human hair is 0.010 of an inch thick. So it's a super, super small tolerance. Once it gets to us at the end, we do still have to check everything that could be a yes or no answer. Do all the measurements line up? Is this technically correct? But that's actually what I call the easy part of what we do, because that just gets to be a yes or no answer. Sometimes it's tedious to find out, but it's a lot easier than what comes next, which is really listening to the instrument and hearing anything that you can manipulate in some way. So we have a set of measurements that everything is made to, and then we kind of like play around with them after that. So the ear training, and Aiven can also talk more about this later when she's talking about head joint making and adjusting and things like that. The ear training is actually the hardest part of what we do. And not everyone actually has the same level of aptitude for it, for lack of a better word, really. It's taking everything that we learned to hear as a flutist and then kind of like setting it aside and not putting as much of ourselves into it, but letting the voice of the flute come out. So needless to say, I don't play out much anymore because I'll listen to my own flute and like, oh, shoot, that means no, I can't do that. I've got to like focus on me and playing when I'm actually performing. But the same level of focus that we use to practice and to create our own sound and our own voice while we're playing, we kind of take a step outside of ourselves and listen to the flute itself or the head joint itself that way when we're making it. So I'll play the flute down, I'll decide everything feels good under my hands, and then I'll be like, okay, so does each note balance the one above and below it? Do all registers match evenly? And then we'll manipulate the flute in some way to kind of take out anything that's like a hitch in between the notes, anything that gets in the way of that characteristic, like sweet, flexible, fluid, rich Haynes sound. Like we want it to be that characteristic, like this. It's the beginning of the American flute companies. It was the foundation of American flute playing. It has a very iconic sound. And while the sound has changed through the generations and over the years, as the demands of flute players have changed, we still want to have that core there. So once we understand what the playing characteristics of the Haynes flutes are, then we can kind of hear for anything that doesn't really fit and kind of take that away. The good news is that any of the core of it is designed in the measurements, in the way the keys feel, in the way the scale is made. And then that extra personality that takes it from, this is a really good flute, to, oh my gosh, I need that. That's what I was trying to say. Like, that's the part that we're really focusing on bringing out through playing at the end.
Ooh, I love that. So before we get into pulling out the personality of the flute, Aiven, there's something that Joyce said that I want to interject into this conversation, and that is the evenness, the tony quality. So I'm a flute teacher, and I will go to Carolyn Nussbaum's flute shop probably once a week and do flute trials with my students. And the flutes will be lined up 1 through 10. I don't know names. I don't know brands, nothing. I don't want to know. And I just want to know, like, I'm listening for the tone, the consistency, all of these different things, the range of the instrument, the colors, everything. The one thing after we're all done, said and done, going through this blind process, both student and teacher, I will then later be like, oh, what flute was number 1? What flute was number 2? And 9 times out of 10, if not 11 times out of 10, I'm always noticing that my note for the Haynes flutes is consistent tone, consistency from low B all the way to high C7 every single time. And I was not planning on bringing this up, but literally you lovingly forced my hand to say that because it's unmatched. And that's something that I just want to bring to your attention because I hear that as a flutist and as a flute teacher.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And I'm saying yays and yeah, and excited faces. So yeah, so bravo. Hats off to you because that is one characteristic of Haynes flutes that is so noticeable to me. I'm glad you brought that up. And then bringing out the personality of each instrument, Aiven, oh my goodness, it sounds like Harry Potter with the wand and all of that jazz.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a little bit the wand chooses you, right?
Yeah.
But I want to go back to that evenness of sound. That is my whole job. I get to not worry quite as much as Joy and David about these tiny measurements. You know, I'm going for a very distinct shape. I'm going for it. I mean, I say that knowing full well that I'm going for a target that is within like 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch, but I'm only dealing with one thing, right? So the head joints are made on almost a different production line than the flutes. They're being made separate from the bodies, and eventually they will meet up with the bodies at the other end of the process. So when I get it, it looks like a head joint. You know, if you put a cork in it, it would feel like a head joint, but then I have to hand carve it. But yeah, it's that evenness of sound. It's actually what I'm going for the whole time. And when I'm talking to people on tours, or sometimes I do a head joint class where I actually finish a head joint for people so that they can try it. I always tell them, like, you know, usually right off the bat, I get a sound structure that is more or less like, maybe sometimes it's like tight at the top, but really nice at the bottom, right? So then I have to go in. Then that's where the patience kind of does pay off. I actually am a patient person. I don't sell myself as one, but I kind of am. That's when I have to go in and find where it's tight, change that, and then open that top up without losing the bottom, because everything that I do in a head joint has an opposite reaction somewhere else. So that's my first and foremost goal, is that evenness of sound. So I'm glad it's paying off. And then, maintaining that Haynes personality, they are all different. People always ask me if there's a way to, make an exact copy of a head joint I made 2 years ago. Nope. That will never happen. It will look the same, and it might even measure the same, but it's not going to be exactly the same. And I think that's part of the reason why you want a custom head joint. They're all slightly different, and you're going to find the one that matches you, just like the wands.
That's amazing. So going back to the wand analogy, Joy had mentioned this earlier. So bringing out the voice and bringing out the unique characteristics of each wand. What are you listening for? What are you looking for? How do you let that specific instrument sing to its fullest? Is it the cut of the head joint? Walk me through the process. And I'm sure it's multi-layered.
It's a little bit of the cut of the head joint.
Okay.
It's a little bit of how the flute is voiced. So I will also let Joy jump in here too, because when I'm done. It's a Haynes. It is as even as I can get it. And then we'll match it up with the flute usually. And then Joy does some magic too. And then we will adjust to each other to make sure that this is working well together.
Yeah. So with the flute body, so when Aiven's cutting head joints and voicing her head joints and doing the final adjustments, she has one flute body that she plays all of her head joints on. Likewise, when I'm working on the body of a flute, I have one head joint that I'm testing all of the flutes on. So we can eliminate one of the variables for each of our individual steps. So for the flute, we hit those target numbers to begin with. And then after that, when we're listening, it might be lowering or raising the opening of the keys a little bit to make a particular note sing a little bit more. It might be sanding or even sometimes reshaping the inside of a tone hole in a certain point to make the flute feel and ring more freely. There are certain techniques that we know. On like a silver flute, I'm probably going to do this much here. On a gold flute, I'm going to try to make it feel a little bit here, because you don't want the gold to feel too heavy or too mellow. Sometimes you still want it to be vibrant. So over the years, we learned different techniques for certain individual metal combinations. But then when it comes down to it, we sound a little bit, for lack of a better word, crazy sometimes, because we actually, over the course of working on a single flute, like an actual personality will present itself in the flute. Like there have been multiple times when like, this one is fighting me. I don't know why. I'm just trying to love it. It's being difficult. It doesn't want to open itself up to me, and I don't understand why. All I've done is try to give it life. And then other ones are like super agreeable. Everything I did right the first time just worked. It was amazing. And now I get to go home and play on it over the weekend, and it's outstanding. So it's really just finding where within our range of motion that we have in terms of how we can adjust a flute or a head joint, like where do we have to hit the sweet spot in order to like really make it vibrant? I don't have a great analogy other than that. Even I don't know if you do.
Oh, that sounds right. I mean, I forgot about that fact that reducing the variables with my test head joint and Joy's test flute, and how that really lets us focus on what is becoming and coming out of these head joints and flutes that we're working on. That's really a key thing. And then they really do become a whole character when they're together. Really, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I love that. I had no idea, but listening to you all talk about the process, it sounds like you have to be intuitive to some degree in order to listen to what the flute is telling you and the feedback that it's giving you. And from a flute teacher perspective, it sounds like the different students who come through my door. Why is this one student really giving me a hard time? Like, I'm giving you a compliment and you're telling me that, you know, it's not that good, go away. When I give the same compliment to another student, they're like, oh, thank you. And everything is just gelling beautifully. So sometimes it's water and water, sometimes it's oil and water, and you have to figure out how to make it flow. And that's what I hear from the perspective of my teaching world.
That's a perfect analogy. That's exactly it. It's like just like the way you find the right avenue in to bring out the best in a student, that we're trying to find the right avenue within our toolbox to bring out the best voice of the flute.
Ooh.
And that does kind of extend back to actually making the physical instrument, because there's a lot of ways that I'm approached all the time with like technological like solutions to like the problems that we have in manufacturing flutes, but it really is intuitive, and everything matters when you're making a flute. The type of solders, even the temperature at which you solder things, it affects the sound in the end. And over the course of like the 100 years of the Haynes Flute Company, more than that, a lot of best practices have been developed for the end result to make the flute, to give Aiven and Joy what they need to do what they just described to doing. And there's a lot of there's things that can be made like over engineering the flute, or using like substituting some of the traditional ways we do stuff with more modern ways. And they could be on paper like more efficient, it could be on paper like more accurate, but the instrument suffers at the end. And we're open to like innovation, and we're open to changing and improving techniques. That's not a problem, but it has to support what Aiven and Joy do at the end to make that instrument come out and to be as intuitive and flexible, and to have those personalities come out. Too much, you could engineer the personality out of a flute very easily. Or a head joint. The hardest thing to do is to keep the personality in, and knowing what to keep and what to kind of advance as far as technology goes in making the instrument. But the easiest thing to do is to engineer all the personality and life and soul out of a musical instrument. So it's a
Interesting.
balance. Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, you can never forget that you're making a musical instrument.
Okay.
And there are best practices that have been proven over time that just cannot be substituted with anything that we have available now. Like people talk about artificial intelligence, and I always say, well, we use genuine intelligence. And no matter what the computer is or the measuring device is on the planet as it stands today, it's never going to be as sensitive as a human eye or a human touch, or all those measuring and devices are simply, they're kind of, less accurate and less, there's not as much depth in them as a human eye or a human hand. And so that's what I basically provide, the platform for the instruments to be brought to life.
Oh my goodness, you guys, like I could either jump up and down in so much giddiness or start bawling my eyes out. I had no idea that this conversation was going to go this direction. And I am so blessed that it has, because I have learned a tremendous amount from all three of you. And just the humanness the humanist side of flute making was something that, I mean, again, I sound doinky saying this, but like I was aware of, but I didn't know and I wasn't aware of how much heart goes into each part of the process and how you guys then are pulling out that humanness, that personality from each instrument. And my mind is completely blown. I just feel like I dove into a world that I had no idea I was diving into. So thank you, thank you, thank you. As we are wrapping up this conversation, is there something, and you all have hinted at it, but I don't want to jump to conclusions. Is there anything about the Haynes company, about the Haynes flutes, that you want the public to know, that you feel like they don't know, or you really want to emphasize X characteristic, to shout from the rooftops like, this is what I love about the Haynes team. This is what I love about the company, the flutes. Tell me all of it. And you can start, Aiven, if you want to.
Oh, okay, I will. This is a great team to be on. It's just an amazing experience. And it sounds really cheesy for me to say this, but like this is the best team in the world. We love our jobs and we love making flutes and making them for other people. And the best part of our jobs is talking to flute players and realizing that we've made their jobs a little bit easier and that they can actually use our instruments as their voice, which is really, it's the best job in the world.
Oh, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
David, what would you like to contribute?
Well, when I started here in 1986, Lou DeVoe still owned the company. And every time you'd get a gold flute to make, he'd always say, well, put a little love in it. And I think that's what we really do. We put a little love into what we do, and we still do that today. And I really think that, like, if you really care about your job and you really love what you're doing, like we all do, that the instruments come out that much better, or better than just something that's mass produced. And everything that's made in the Haynes company, the custom flutes are all made here. Like the parts are all made locally. Everything's really sourced. The castings come locally. The parts come locally. And the entire custom Haynes flute is made within these walls by the crew and the people that we have here that truly love their job and love what they do at every step. So that's what I would say.
Oh, thank you, David. I love that. And Joy?
Yeah, if I can tie it all together here, it really is the fact that the team that makes these flutes is a very small and very cohesive team. And no one is here with the feeling that they failed out of something else. Like nobody thought, well, I couldn't cut it as a flute player. I couldn't cut it as a teacher. We all chose this as the way that we could best do the thing that drove us to getting into art in the beginning. Pretty much everyone comes from one art background or another, or has in-depth experience in one form of art or another. And really, it's the fact that we all wanted to create music. We all wanted to bring something that was evocative into the world in one way or another. And now we get to do the thing that makes other people be able to perform. So really just, again, bringing the human factor back into the flutes, or not that it's ever necessarily left, but bringing out the emotional connection and the organic nature of music and art is pretty much what we really try to do.
Oh my goodness. Yes, yes, yes. I love it. If there is a flutist out there who's really interested in anything and everything that you three just described, and they're like, heck yeah, I want to be a flute maker. I want to, make some head joints. Do they reach out to you? Do they reach out? What's the next step for said person?
So if somebody is out there and they're thinking about it, it's just like Joy said, you miss 100. Did you say you miss 100% of the shots you don't take? You should try.
Okay.
And we are always looking for people who are interested in doing this as a career. We definitely want to talk to you. You can reach out to me. That's probably the easiest way to go about it for a start. It's Aiven, AIVEN at WMSHaynes.com. And yeah, we can start a conversation and see where it goes from there. But yeah, we're definitely always interested in hearing from you.
Thank you, Aiven. I will definitely put your email address in the show notes below.
Sure.
So if you are a Flute 360 listener and you're listening to this and you're thinking, yes, 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 Aiven's email address is there for your convenience. And I just want to thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for taking out time, for sharing your backgrounds and what you do for the company and through the company. And thank you for sharing, most importantly, your passion. You can see it on all three of your faces, how you get really giddy and excited about within your own niche. And I learned a lot. And I know that the listeners have learned a lot too. So thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, friend, before you go away, one quick note. If you want to be a part of a flute community who really cares, then feel free to join my private Facebook group. It's called the Flute 360 Family, and you can access it through Facebook. I have made it easy peasy, and I have shared the link below in the show notes. So go ahead and click that link, request to join the group, and I will approve of it, and this way you can start accessing flutists from across the globe. I am very proud of this network because we support each other. Every Friday, I post a prompt to say, hey, share the latest and greatest of your music world, music events, links below. Another bonus feature, another perk of this group is that we go deep. We talk about things that move you, things that you're passionate about, and your pain points. So if this interests you, feel free to join, and we can't wait to see you there. Thanks. Let's talk about flute.